it a minute and we'll get started in a second. Just wait for people. All right, great. Thank you everyone for coming to this African Bioinformatics and African Plant Breeders Association joint Agri-Informatics webinar series and hackathon. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Bruce Walsh for Lecture 6, which will be on quantitative genetics, matrices, and multiple trait selection. Professor Bruce Walsh is an associate head of the department and professor of ecology and evolution biology at the University of Arizona. He's interested broadly in using mathematical models to explore the interface of genetics and evolution, with particular focus on two areas: the evolution of genome structure and the analysis of complex genetic characters, also known as quantitative genetics. So thank you, Bruce, for giving us this lecture. Over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you're all doing well. I'm recovering from the U.S., kind of giving a poor showing in the World Cup after doing so well, but that's why it's called the World Cup. What I want to do today is talk about matrices. And the reason I wanted, let me just finish closing up everything here. Just give me a second. My little arrow is disappearing up here. Come on, I see you there. Pardon me for staring at the screen, but I've got a little, okay. So what I want to do today is talk about using matrices. And if you're a breeder, one of the most important mathematical tools you're going to be using is this idea about matrices. Now, the good news about matrices is all the calculations we're going to do are done on a computer. So when I teach this class in person, I ask the class, how do you invert a matrix? And I have them tell me back, on a computer. If I ask them how they compute the determinant of a matrix, I have them respond back on a computer. And I keep going until they get the point that once you understand the basic ideas, all the work is done for you on a computer. And matrices are the most powerful tool you're going to use as a breeder. Matrices are what we use to put the so-called general linear model in that Rika's talked a little bit about. Experimental design fits within that. Matrices underpin multi-trait and index selection. We'll talk about multi-trait and index selection tomorrow. That lecture will be about 70 minutes or so, not much longer. It'll be a little bit longer. So matrices are really, really useful. And there's a couple of key concepts that once you learn them, matrices are actually pretty straightforward. Just give me a second here. It tends to, okay. So as in the previous three lectures, I've put additional reading on the website. Chapters 9 and 10 from the Blue Book, the 2025 book, along with Appendix 3. So 9 is an introduction to matrices, 10 is linear models in matrix form, and Appendix 3 from the 2025 book is additional topics, like generalized inverses. I also put Appendix 5 from the 2018 Black Book over here, and that's a chapter on eigenstructure. So basically, between those four chapters, you sort of have all the matrix machinery you're going to be needing for almost anything you're going to do in your career. So I recommend printing those up and having them around. Again, I want to stress, as with all these lectures, the key point is not to try to remember all the details. You look up the details. The key point is remembering some of the basic concepts and some of the basic motivations for those concepts. So with that in mind, what are we going to talk about today? Well, I'm going to give you definition of matrices and vectors. We'll talk about how you quantify how big they are, that is their dimensionality. We'll talk about addition and subtraction. Those ideas are pretty straightforward. The idea that's a little bit weird if you haven't seen it before is matrix multiplication. I'll try to motivate where that comes from. Then we'll talk about inverses of matrices. And matrices arise in breeding because we're trying to solve sets of equations. You may not see the sets of equations, but on the underlying, under the engine, basically, under the hood, what you're doing is someone set up a set of equations and you're trying to solve for them. We'll talk about quadratic products and covariances. These allow us to do things like estimate the variance of a selection index. Then we'll talk about eigenstructure, that is eigenvalues, eigenvectors, and principal components. And throughout, I'll kind of scatter some basic matrix calculations and show you how they're done in R. I won't go through them, but I'll show you basically how simple they are to do. So what exactly is a matrix? Well, move this. Give me a half a second. I've got a little bar of this, and then I'll move that down over here. So what exactly is a matrix? Well, it's simply either a list, in which case we call it a vector. So it's either a single row, it's a row vector, or a column vector, or it's simply an array. So an Excel spreadsheet with entries in the cells in that Excel spreadsheet is a matrix. And we typically use the notation that a bold lowercase letter indicates a vector, and a vector could either be a column vector, so one single column and 1, 2, 3 rows, or it could be a row vector, one single row, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4 columns. Now, usually in a field, there's a default to write a specific type of vector. For example, most of statistics and most of breeding uses column vectors. So when you see a vector, the assumption is typically a column vector. One thing you'll notice here is I've also indexed this vector. This vector is 3 by 1. Why? Well, rows and columns. It's got 1, 2, 3 rows and 1 column. So the 1 here in the rightmost position tells you it's a column. Over here, the row vector, the 1 in the leftmost position, 1 row and 4 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4. So a special case, a 1 by 1 number, for example, 12. A 1 by 1 is called the scalar, and we typically don't write the dimensions in that case. And one of the reasons we mention that is a big line of matrices where a bunch of operations are done. Oftentimes the result is a 1 by 1 element that is a number or a scalar. So vectors are either a row or a column, and we typically work with column vectors, and we have to specify their dimensions. The way to think about the order is think about railroad car, rows and columns, or Roman Catholic. Now, a general matrix is simply an array, rectangular. It could be square. For example, C is a square matrix. It's got the same number of rows and columns. In this case, it's a 3 by 3, but they don't have to be square. For example, D is a non-square matrix, and it has 1, 2, 3 rows and 2 columns, so it's a 3 by 2. So again, we often, but not always, write down the dimensions. So I might, for example, put C 3 by 3. Likewise, how do I specify an element in a matrix? It's just like an element in a spreadsheet in Excel. So what's the 2 element? It's the element that's in row 2, column 2. What about the 3 1 element? Well, 3, right? 3 says row 3, 1 says column 1. So the 3 by 1 element is a 1. So 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 1, 1, 2, 2, those are called diagonal elements. And those are defined even if a matrix isn't square. So we very often talk about diagonal elements versus off-diagonal elements. Diagonal means row and column index are the same. Off-diagonal is sort of everything else. So vectors are a list or a row. We typically work with a column vector. Those are written in lowercase bold letters. Usually we write matrices in uppercase bold letters. Special case is a square matrix, but they can be non-square. So the definition is pretty straightforward at this point. And so first thing to ask is, well, if I have some matrices, can I do what are called binary, that is two matrix operations, or unitary operations involving a single matrix? And the first thing you'll notice is that C and D here are actually different structures. So can I do operations on C and D? Well, it turns out you can do some operations, but not others. Let's talk about the simplest one, matrix addition and subtraction. So can I add or subtract two matrices? And the answer is you can't add or subtract two random matrices, but you can add or subtract two matrices that both have the same number of rows and also have the same number of columns. That is, if two matrices have the same dimension, so for example, 6 rows and 4 columns, you can add and subtract them. And the reason is addition and subtraction is exactly what you think. The element in row I, column J for the matrix A plus B is the element in row I, column J for A plus row I, column J for B. If an element exists in A but isn't found in B, if this is 3 by 3 and this is 5 by 5, There's no 5 by 5 element in A. That operation isn't defined. So addition and subtraction is exactly what you might think it would be, and it also makes sense the matrices have to have the same dimension. As we'll see, it's a little bit different when we talk about multiplication. So here I've got A and B. These are both square matrices. They don't have to be square as long as A and B have the same number of rows and A and B have the same number of columns, which could be different number of rows. You can add or subtract them. So for example, C here, this element is 3 plus 1 is 4. This element is 0 plus 2 is 2. This element down here is 2 plus 1 or 3. What about A minus B? Well, this element is 2 minus 1, sorry, 3 minus 1 is 2. This element down here is 0 minus 2 or minus 2, and so forth. So addition and subtraction is kind of exactly what you think, nothing special about them. Now let's do something that seems a little bit odd at first, but it illustrates a point and also leads us into talking about matrix multiplication. You can what's called partition a matrix. So on the far left here, I have that 3 by 3 matrix, but I can also write that 3 by 3 matrix here, where now the elements of the matrix aren't numbers, but are a scalar, vectors, and a matrix, right? So if I define A to be 3, B to be a column vector, B to be this row vector, D to be this column vector, and big B to be this 2 by 2 matrices, this element and these are exactly the same. And we call that a partition. And why might you do that? Well, for example, suppose you're trying to do prediction. And 3 may be what you're trying to predict, and this is information on markers. Again, it'd be much larger, but the idea here is you'd partition the matrix into what you're trying to predict, for example, phenotypes, and other information, for example, markers. So partitioning matrices is something that happens fairly common. In particular, I can write this matrix as a row vector whose elements are column vectors, or as a column vector whose elements are row vectors. Now let's see exactly what I mean by that. Here's that same matrix C. I've now written it as a column vector. So it's a column with elements 1, 2, and 3. And element 1 is this row vector. Element 2 is that row vector. Element 3 is that row vector. So I can write this matrix as a column vector whose individual elements are row vectors. We'll see why we want to do that in a second. Or I can write this same matrix as a row vector whose individual elements are column vectors. Now you might ask, why do we do that? And the reason we do that is this is the basis for matrix multiplication, as we'll see in a second. So let's go back now and motivate this idea behind matrix multiplication. We're going to start with something called a dot product. It's often called an inner product, but I'm going to reserve the inner product for something a bit differently. So I have two vectors. Is their dot product defined? Their dot product is defined if the two vectors have the same number of elements in them. So A and B, while one is a row and one is a column, they both have 4 elements in them. If, for example, A had a 0, it would still have 4 elements, one of the elements being 0. So the number of slots in A is the same as the number of slots in B. Imagine this is kind of a structure with little boxes to put marbles in. As long as the same number of boxes in A and B, the dot product is defined. And the dot product is first element in A times first element in B, second in A, second in B, third in A, third in B, fourth in A, fourth in B. So if A had 5 elements and B only had 4, this dot product wouldn't be defined. So the dot product of A and B is 1 times 4 plus 2 times 5 plus 3 times 7 plus 4 times 9. Their dot product is 60. And the reason we use this dot product is to motivate the following. So this is 3 equations and 3 unknowns, x1, x2, and x3. And most of matrix algebra, also called linear algebra, at some level is dealing with this problem. So there's kind of 3 obvious questions. Number 1, how do you solve this? Number 2, is there one solution? Is there no solution? Is there 3 solutions? And as we'll see with a linear system, you've got 3 possibilities. There's exactly one solution, there's no solution, or there's a line or a plane or a hyperplane. So if I have x1 plus x2 equals 1, 2x1 plus 2x2 equals 2, the solution is a line, x1 equals 1 minus x2. So when you have a set of equations, you have exactly one solution, or you have no solutions, or you've got a plane or a hyperplane or a set of solutions, basically infinitely many. So how do we find those? How do we solve those? These are the concepts of a determinant of a matrix and inverse of a matrix. We're going to flush those out. But the most obvious question is, this is three equations, three unknowns. Can we write that compactly? Well, let's do this. Let's look at these leading coefficients, 5, 6, 4, 7 minus 3, 5, minus 1, minus 1, 6. And I can write those in this matrix over here. That's what I know. Then I have what's unknown. I'm trying to solve for x1, x2, x3. I know the first equation equals 6, the second minus 9, the third 12. Well, this is writing that in matrix form. Does that make sense? Let's look at the dot product of this row vector on that column vector. What is it? It's 5x1, 6x2, 4x3 equals 6. Oh, hey, that's this first equation. What about this second equation? 7x1 minus 3x2 plus 5x3 equals 9. Hey, so now I've taken this three equations, three unknowns, and written it as this matrix expression. A matrix whose elements I know, X, a vector I'm trying to solve for, and C, a vector that I also know. So if I have something like a division, so if I can, air quotes, divide each side by A, I get X equals A inverse times C. So if A inverse exists and is unique, I have a single solution of these equations, and it's given by that. Now, here's the real power of matrices. This equation down here is the solution to a 3 by 3 set of equations. I just give A and C. It's exactly the same solution to a 10 million by 10 million set of equations. In North American dairy cattle, for example, we have over 10 million records. And to estimate breeding values for individuals, we solve a massive set of equations, which is kind of like 10 million by 10 million equations and unknowns. We use this exact same expression. So you just type that expression there into your computer. That is, you have the computer input your A, input your C, and I'll show you the command in R in a second. You write down that command and it'll solve it if it's a 3 by 3 or a 10 million by 10 million. This is the real power of matrices, is very compact notations let you handle very, very difficult, very, very challenging problems. Let me give you an example. Don't get too freaked out by this. So this is a partial or multiple regression. So suppose I'm trying to, for example, to predict yield as a function of different SNPs. So Z1 is a SNP that you're scoring, either going to score it as 0 for one homozygote, 1 for a heterozygote, or 2 for the alternate homozygote. So for example, it could be the number of so-called reference alleles. We call one allele the non-reference. So a homozygote non-reference would have a value of 0. A heterozygote would have a value of 1. A homozygote has 2 copies, have a value of 2. So I'm trying to predict yields as a function of these individual SNP scores. What I want to know are these weights. The more general way to think about this expression is I'm, for example, trying to predict growth as a function of a whole bunch of metabolic parameters. Now, these metabolic parameters are correlated. So what I'd like to do is ask if I could hold all the parameters constant. If I change parameter 1 by 1 unit, how much change do I see in growth? That's what the partial regression does. Multiple regression, multiple regression, same thing. So what B1 here says, beta 1 says that a single unit change in Z1 holding everything else constant changes Y by B1. So how do we solve for that? Well, it turns out one way to solve is you can go ahead and get this set of equations by taking the covariance of this side with the left side with the right side. Sorry, taking the covariance of y with z1. So you take covariance of this with z1, you get that expression. Covariance of y with z2, and you get this set of equations. It looks big and messy, but you can write it in this form here. This expression on the left is something we'll see a lot of. It's called a variance covariance matrix. Why? It's a square matrix. It's n by n. On the diagonal, variance of trait 1, variance of trait 2, variance of trait n. So variances are on the diagonal. On the off diagonal are all the covariances. So we know those. Betas, these weights we're trying to estimate. And here we have the covariance of y with z1, y with z2. Again, that's something we know. It turns out with data, I can write this as x transpose x, where x is the data matrix. Beta, this is x transpose y. So when I solve this, I get beta equals x transpose x quantity inverse x transpose y. I haven't told you yet what transpose mean. I haven't told you what an inverse means. I haven't simplified it. But this equation down here, hang on a second here, this beta hat equals x transpose x inverse x transpose y, that's called the general linear model. And almost everything you've probably seen in statistics is solved by that. So regression, a t-test, analysis of variance, analysis of covariance, polynomial regressions, just about everything you've seen, that's the answer. And this handles arbitrary designs, and that's the power of matrices. This is something called the general linear model. We may have talked about that a little bit, and we'll probably talk about it a little bit more as the course progresses. But one of the reasons matrices are so powerful statistics is this is a solution to a huge, huge, huge number of statistical problems. And you see the answer is very, very straightforward, very, very simple. So with that motivation now, let's talk about what it means to multiply two matrices. So key feature number one, the order in which matrices are multiplied matters. It could be that A and B are such you can multiply them, but B and A, when I switch the order, are such you can't multiply them. So order matters. And it's not what you think. If A is 3 by 2 and B is 3 by 2, I can't multiply those, even though they have the same dimension. Why? For matrix multiplication to exist, the matrices must do something called conform. It means the number of columns on the first matrix, A, that I'm multiplying, must equal the number of rows in B. So if A is 3 by 2 and B is 3 by 2, you can't multiply a 3 by 2 times a 3 by 2. And we'll see how that comes in, how you can tell that in a second. So here's how you write that. I'm now writing down the subscripts. A and B are said to conform if these inner subscripts matches. It means, remember, row column, number of columns in A equals rows in B. And the resulting matrix has dimensions R by C. So inner subscripts match, says you can multiply them. Outer subscript says, what's the new matrix going to be? What's its dimensionality? And the reason we write it this way is the ith, jth element in C is a dot product. It's the dot product of the first row in A on the first column in B, the 1, 1, or the ith row in A on the jth column in B. So is that dot product defined? Well, if I go across a row in A, that row has k elements because it's got k columns. If I go down a column in B, that element has k rows. So if these inner subscripts match, I can dot product the first row on the first column. And that's where this idea about confirmation comes in. Now, again, don't worry about this too much because when you do this in R, it'll tell you that you made a mistake if you can't do that. But that's why you heard this thing about matrices conform. Likewise, the order matters. So here's the shortcut for that. If the inner subscripts match, so the number of columns in A equals the number of rows in B, then this product is defined. The resulting matrix you get is given by the outer subscripts. So this resulting matrix is going to be R by C. So down here, for example, here's 4 matrices I'm multiplying together. Does it exist? If so, what's its dimensionality? Well, let's look at it. A times B, well, I can multiply them because those match. That's a 3 by 9. What about AB times C? Well, That's a 3 by 9 times a 9 by 6. Yep, that's a 3 by 6. What about ABC times D? Well, that's a 3 by 6 times a 6 by 23. So resulting matrix is 3 by 23. Very often, that will start with a 1, that will end with a 1. So all those matrix calculations give you a number. For example, that happens with things like sums of squares. So in particular, and again, we're almost through this multiplication is a little bit grinding. I want to multiply two matrices. I'll call one Mary because I can't enunciate my M and N's clearly. I want to multiply the matrix Mary times the matrix Nancy, or we'll call them Mike and November if you want. So I can write Mary over here has a column vector whose individual elements are row vector. I can write Nancy down here as a row vector, sorry, as a row vector whose individual elements are column vectors. When I multiply Mary by Nancy, the 2 element is the first row vector here times, sorry, the 2 is the second row vector here times the second column vector there. And that gives me the element in here. So each of these is a dot product. Now, that's what's going on. In reality, here's what you do. So very simple case of 2 by 2. Can I multiply two by 2 matrices? Yes. If matrices are square, if two matrices are square, you can multiply them and actually in either order. So 2 by 2 times 2 by 2, intersubscripts match, you can multiply them, the result is a 2 by 2. What is this element? It's that row vector, sorry about that row vector on that column vector, A, E, B, G. What about this element here, the 1, 2, 1 on 2, A, F, B, H, etc. Now, if I flip the order, I can still multiply them because I've got a 2 by 2 and a 2 by 2 intersubscripts match. You see, these are different. So even when you can multiply them in different orders, you're not guaranteed. In fact, they're almost always different. So the order matters. Now let's talk practically. Here's how you do it. I'm not going to go through the code, but you all either should know about R and use it or find out about R. R is the most widely used statistical software in the world. It's open source, so people are putting new stuff on all the time. And most importantly, it's totally free. If you're ever working with R and get stuck about how to do something, you can just Google it or have AI write you the code. So you guys should certainly know that R exists and start playing with R. R has many, many, many different layers. I use it as an online, like a line-based calculator. You can write all sorts of programming and scripts in it. There are all sorts of interfaces like R Shiny. So let me just show you how you multiply two matrices in R. This up here is old school. This is writing in the matrices A and B using R. You can use RStudio to write this in an Excel spreadsheet and move them in. So once you tell it what A is and once you tell it what B is, the multiply command is simple. It's percent star percent. And this percent star percent will multiply any matrices that conform. That one line there works as well when you multiply a pair of 2 by 2 matrices as when you multiply a pair of 2 million by 2 million matrices. It just takes a bit longer. This is the power of matrices. No matter how complicated A and B are, once you enter them, that command there tells R to do all the work for you. So it's pretty cool. Let me stop for a second and see if people have questions. Let me remind you what we've talked about so far. And again, if you have questions, use the react button on the bottom to raise your hand. That moves your tile to the front of the queue. I can see who you are. Get you in a second here. So we've talked about vectors and matrices. We've talked about dimensions. We've talked about addition and subtraction, dot products, and we talked about matrix multiplications. Okay, Innocence, go ahead. Innocent, go ahead. You have a question.
Hello, Professor.
Hello.
Yes. Hello, are you able to hear me?
I can hear you just fine, yes.
Oh, yeah. I wanted to understand why we invert matrices before putting them in our linear mix models. What's the main reason for inverting it?
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. But the reason we invert matrices is because we're trying to solve something. So let me go back to over here. Let me go down to, give me a second here. I've lost the share bar on my computer. That happens occasionally. Let me just make it smaller here. There we go. Okay. So here's a set of equations, right? When I want to solve this set, I take an inverse. So this example over here, what I want to do is I want to remove this part of the matrix that is a matrix of known numbers to get at what I'm trying to solve. So how would so what I have is X
Sorry,
transpose X. Don't worry
we
about
don't
that.
actually see the screen. We don't see the screen being shared.
Oh, you don't see the screen? Okay, hang on a second here. Give me half a second. Let me go to share. Okay. Pull it up here. There it is. Thank you. Is that better? Can
Thank you.
Yeah,
people see
we
that now?
see it now. Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. My computer was acting up. So here's a mixed model, a linear model question. And what I have is a matrix here, which I'm going to call X transpose X. Don't worry about that. That just comes from the data. So you have a data matrix X that you know, a data vector Y you know, and it turns out you can write this thing here as X transpose X. Don't worry about that for now. So I'm trying to solve for this vector beta, but I've got X transpose X times beta equals X transpose Y. How do I isolate beta? Well, I divide, air quotes, both sides through by this matrices. That's taking the inverse. So one of the reasons that we use inverses basically is it's when I'm trying to solve sets of equations. So if you see an inverse, it means I'm trying to solve a set of equations. We'll talk about inverses in a second, where they come from. Okay. Was that helpful? Thumbs up. And if it wasn't, let me know. Okay. Um, any other questions so far? So again, we talked about, I think the hardest concept is to get your hand around matrix multiplication because it's kind of weird. Um, and so that's why I think thinking about dot products helps. So let's go back and press on here. Let's see, where am I going to go? There we are. Yeah. So the next concept we're going to talk about is something called the transpose of a matrix. And at first it looks a little bit, why do it? And it turns out there's a deep reason. Um, Recall from calculus, if you want to solve for something, what's the minimal value? You take a derivative. So if I have ax equals c, how do I find the minimum value of x? I take the derivative. And when you take the derivative of a matrix, you get a transpose. Don't worry about that. That's often, not always, but often why transposes arise. And what is a transpose? It simply means you flip the role of rows and columns. So the element in row I, column J of the transpose of A is the element in row J, column I. I'll give you some examples in a second. So we call this the transpose. Useful identities. If A times B exists, then the transpose of A times B is the transpose of B times the transpose of A. A quick application is consider two column vectors A and B. Remember I told you the dot product is often called the inner product, but I'm going to keep that separate. Well, the inner product of A and B is defined as the transpose of A times B. So if that is A is a column vector, its transpose is a row vector. Does this operation make sense? Well, if A is n row and one column, A transpose is one row and n columns. Inner subscripts match, I can multiply them. Outer subscripts tell me I get a one by one element, a scalar. So A transpose B is simply the sum of AI times BI. And we'll see that a lot in breeding. It's a weighted sum. So a classic weighted sum would be a polygenic score. What's a polygenic score? Well, it's your SNP number time for a given locus times the weight you assign to that and sum over all loci. So B could be your 0, 1, 2 SNP scores. A could be the weights. So A transpose B is simply your predicted breeding value given your genotype and given your marker information. So transposes arise quite a bit as weighted sums. We'll see that a lot when we talk about index selection in our last lecture tomorrow. That's an inner product. What about an outer product? Inner product was A transpose B. Outer product is AB transpose. Can I multiply them? Yes, inner subscripts match. Outer products gives me an n by n. So the outer product, instead of giving me a 1 by 1, gives me an n by n. And the ith jth element is simply aibj. So for example, covariance matrices can be written as outer products. We don't see them as much, but transposes flip the matrices around. That leads us to inner products and outer products when we're dealing with vectors. Likewise, a square matrix may be equals transpose. For example, that happens with a covariance matrix. Let's back over here. So this is a square matrix. If I take the transpose of these, the diagonal elements stay where they are. The off-diagonal elements flip. But the covariance of Z1 and Z2 is the same as Z1 and Z2. So covariance matrices are what are called symmetric. They equal their transposes. And square symmetric matrices have certain nice properties we'll talk about in a little bit. So that's the transpose, inner product, outer product. In R, here's the code is very simple. I've entered a matrix A before, I just use T of A. So let's go through that example. Here is a vector A. It's a column vector, 1, 2, 3. Its inner product, A transpose A, is just 14. Its outer product, A transposes this matrix down here. So transposition is an operation that comes up a fair bit. It comes up because sometimes you're looking at weighted sums. Sometimes you have a covariance, but very often you've taken, you don't know you have, but to get the equations you're using, someone's taken a derivative. When you take a derivative, the transpose appears, which is kind of an interesting factor. So we now have everything in hand to get the key idea with matrices, which are determinants, inverses, and solutions. So to start off with, we're going to define an identity matrix. We're going to call this I. And that basically is what's called a diagonal matrix. So diagonal matrix means it's square and it only has elements different from 0 on the diagonal. The identity has 1 on the diagonal and 0s on the off diagonal. And the identity matrix serves the same role as the number 1 in scalar arithmetic. So for example, A times 1 equals 1 times A equals A. With the identity matrix, A times an identity matrix equals an identity matrix times A equals I. By the way, if A is non-square, these two identity matrices have different dimensions. If A is 5 by 3, that's got to be 3 by 3, that's got to be 5 by 5. By convention, we never worry about that. When we write I, we assume it's a square matrix having the appropriate dimensions. Now, why do we care about the inverse? The identity? Well, if I've got a square matrix A, its inverse, if it exists, satisfies this property. A times A inverse equals I, and A inverse times A equals I. Notice I've changed the order. You can only do that when the matrices are square. So this is only defined for square matrices. So inverse and identity matrices have a nice complementarity. So why is the inverse useful? Well, if it exists, we can use the inverse and the identity to solve equations. So in scalar, if I have A times known A, known C, I want to solve for A. Well, to go through all the steps, you'd say, well, the answer is C over A, but there's actually several steps we've done. Let's look at them and recall the order matters. I multiply both sides by 1 over A. 1 over A times AX equals 1 over A times C. Well, 1 over A times A, well, that just gives me 1. 1 times X gives me X, therefore I get X equals 1 over A times C. I've kept the order here because order matters in matrices. So I want to solve AX equals C. I take the inverse of both sides. A inverse AX equals A inverse C. Or A inverse times AX, well, A inverse times A is I, the identity. I times X equals X, therefore I get X equals A inverse times C. So that's the motivation for what the inverse is. An obvious question is, does it exist and can you find it? So quickly, the identity matrix, here's a 3 by 3. It's got ones on the diagonal, zeros on the off diagonal. And again, if A is non-square, that I and that I will have different dimensions. If this is 5 by 3, that would be a 3 by 3. That'll be a 5 by 5. We never worry about that. You just write an identity matrix down. Here's you can write an identity matrix of, for example, size K in R, so you just use the diagonal command. So an obvious question is, does an inverse exist? Let's look at the simplest case of a 2 by 2 matrix. And by the way, answer this now. How do I compute the inverse of a matrix? And the answer is always on a computer. Go ahead and say it for yourself now. Class, how do you compute the inverse of a matrix? On a computer. So I'm showing you all the details, but you use a computer to do these. So you don't worry about how the details are. But let's look at a simple case of a 2 by 2 matrix. Okay? I'm going to tell you this 2 by 2 matrix has this as a solution. So when I have a constant out in front of a matrix, it means I multiply every element by that constant. So is it the case that A times A inverse equals identity? Let's look at this first element. It's AB on D minus C. Well, that gives me A times D minus C. Oh, so I get an AD minus BC divided, so I get a 1 over here. What about this element? It's AD on minus, sorry, AB on minus BA, so it gives me AB minus AB, so I get a 0. Likewise, I get a 0 here. Likewise, I get an AD minus BC here. So that's the answer to a 2 by 2 matrix. And that thing that I've circled is called the determinant. The reason I've circled that, if that's 0, 1 over 0 is not defined. So if that element is 0, the matrix doesn't exist. What's an example where that would be 0? If I've got I've got 1, 1, 2, 2. Well, in sets of equations, those are identical equations multiplied by 2. I only have one equation there, not two, because one's a multiple of the other. In that case, the determinant would be 0. So the determinant, in a sense, tells you how much information you have in a matrix. By the way, how would I compute the determinant of an arbitrary square matrix? And the answer is, go ahead and say it now, on a computer. So inverses and determinants are things you need to think about what they mean. But as we'll see, there are single lines of code on a computer, single short lines like det A or solve A. If the determinant is not 0 for a square matrix, A inverse exists and it's unique. So we talked about sets of equations. Let's go back over here, write our motivating force for sets of equations down here. Does that have a unique solution? If this matrix A has a non-zero determinant, it has a unique inverse. That unique inverse gives me the exact solution, one and only one solution. So a matrix that has a determinant that's not 0 is said to be non-singular. If the determinant is 0, it's said to be singular, and no unique inverse exists, but something called generalized inverses do. And G inverses are discussed in Appendix 3. Give me a second here. I didn't mean to do that. Generalized inverses are discussed in Appendix 3 of Walsh, Fisher, and Lynch. And you have a copy of that appendix. So let me put this on share here. Give me a second here. Stop share. Give me half a second here. Share. Okay. Can everybody see that? I'm assuming sharing is up. If you can't, somebody yell out. Okay. So if the determinant is not zero, the matrix is said to be non-singular. Now, it may be nearly singular. Suppose it's not zero, but it's, let's say, 10 to the minus 7. 1 over 10 to the minus 7 is a big number. So we take 1 over the determinant, and if it's nearly singular, it means it's really tiny. There's a lot of noise in there. It means that some of the equations are almost identical. If the determinant is 0, the matrix is singular, and there's no unique inverse. There's things called G inverses. We often use, pardon me, the notation. Instead of A superscript minus 1, we do A superscript minus. What does a G inverse mean? Well, I suppose I've got 3 equations and 3 unknowns. A G inverse might tell you that x1 equals 2, but all you can say about x2 and x3 is together they equal 6. So this is a set of solutions, not a unique solution. Now, when the determinant is 0, you either have a consistent system, which case you've got a line or a plane or a hyperplane of solutions, or you have no solution. An inconsistent system, x1 plus x2 equals 0, 2x1 plus 2x2 equals 6. That's inconsistent. Determinant is 0, but it's an inconsistent system. So either have one solution, the determinant is not 0. So if the determinant is not 0, you have a unique solution. If the determinant is 0, you either have no solutions, it's inconsistent, or you have a line or a plane or a family of solutions. And Appendix 3 tells you how the G inverse looks at those. And again, I won't go into that, but you can look that in Appendix 3 if you're interested. How do I compute the determinant and the inverse in R? It's incredibly simple. The command solve computes the inverse of A. Determinant computes the determinant. So for example, here I've entered a matrix A. There's this inverse. That's just rounding error. There's the determinant, and there's the inverse. So a couple of useful identities. And again, these are things you look up, don't memorize. If A inverse exists, then the inverse, the transpose, is the transpose of the inverse. So if A inverse exists, its transpose equals the inverse of A transpose. If A and B both exist, then there's inverses, then the inverse of A and B exists, and is simply B inverse times A inverse. If I have a diagonal matrix D, then the determinant, and we often write the determinant as this kind of absolute value sign, is the product of the diagonal elements. So if I have an identity matrix, what's its determinant? It's 1. 1 times 1 times 1 times 1. So with the diagonal element, you can look at the determinant. It's simply the product of all the diagonal elements. If I have a diagonal matrix and one element is 0, what's its determinant? 0. The final thing we want to tie and make the connections with is this very important concept called eigenvalues and eigenvectors. So if I have a square matrix, its determinant is the product of the eigenvalues of that matrix. What exactly are eigenvalues? So imagine, and let me go off here and actually go back. Let me just stop sharing here. So look at me up here in the screen. So that is a vector. It is a line. So a 2 by 2 vector is line. When I multiply that vector by a matrix, what have I done? I've changed the angle and I've scaled it. So when you multiply a vector by a matrix, it rotates it and it scales it, makes it larger or smaller. So rotation and scaling. The eigenvalues and eigenvectors tell you about that rotation and scaling. Let's go back over here. So what I've written down here is if I have a vector E, think of my hand pointing a direction. When I multiply that vector by the matrix A, lambda is a constant. I get the vector E back out again. Getting the vector E back out again means its direction doesn't change, but its length is scaled by this thing called lambda. Vectors that satisfy this property, when you multiply them by a matrix, their direction doesn't change, are called eigenvectors. And they're the natural geometry of a matrix. Those scaling factors are called eigenvalues. So if I have an eigenvalue 0, it means I've got some combination of the A So A times E gives me a vector of zeros. That means I've got redundant equations. So the product, if I've got an n by n matrix, I've got n eigenvalues associated with that. So this leads us into something that's a bit more powerful. If I have a determinant of zero, it means there's no unique solution. That determinant of zero arises because one or more of the eigenvalues of A is zero. Think about A as your matrix of weights on your sets of equations. If I have a determinant of zero, it means one of those equations can be written as a linear combination of the others. Instead of n unique equations, you've got, for example, n minus 1. All a zero determinant tells you is at least one equation is redundant. So at least one eigenvalue is zero. The number of zero eigenvalues tell you how many equations are redundant. So I've got case A, 10 equations, 10 unknowns. Case B, 10 equations, 10 unknowns. Both have a determinant of zero. In case A, I've got one zero eigenvalue. What does that mean? It means I've got 9 distinct equations. In case B, I've got 9 zero eigenvalues. What does that mean? You've got one unique equation. So eigenvalues, the number of non-zero eigenvalues, tell you a lot more about the structure of your data than does the determinant. So determinant is the product of the eigenvalues. The determinant is zero if and only if at least one eigenvalue is zero. What that means is you've got one combination of the A's where when you take A times E, you get out a vector of zeros. It means some of the parts of A can be written as combinations of the others. So let me stop sharing for a second here. There we go. So we've talked about determinants, inverses. So if the determinant is not zero, the matrix is said to be non-singular and an inverse exists. We've talked about this concept of eigenvalues and eigenvectors. If this is a vector, when I multiply it by a matrix, I change its direction, I rotate it, I change its length. If I have a vector when I multiply it by a matrix, it doesn't change direction, but its length changes. That vector that doesn't change direction is called an eigenvector. The length at which is changing is called the eigenvalue. And as we'll see in a second, those are involved in things like principal components, etc. So questions about those concepts so far? Let me look and see what the questions are here. Oh, there's Paul Gibson here. So questions up to this point. Again, here's what I really, really, really want to stress. Especially in an online lecture like this, just think about grabbing some of the key, I'll get to the question posed in a second, some of the key concepts, even if only loosely. Then when you go back and read the notes, you'll be in a much better position to understand them. Think about activation energy in chemistry, right? It takes a lot of energy to get somewhere. Well, the lecture lowers that energy, which means if you go back and read the notes, things will make a little bit more sense. As you read them a couple times, things will make more sense. Let me see what the question down here is. Basic question. In genomic prediction is often rank deficient. Yeah, so that's Nilsson. So yeah, so Nilsson, that's a good technical question, Nilsson. So there's a couple things you can do. The main way to think about that is when you make a G inverse, you can still, even if the matrix is fully, if the matrix has degeneracies, you still can get out a prediction from that. And the rest of that prediction is in that null space where it really doesn't matter. So that's a technical point. We can chat about that a little bit later. Other questions? And again, just use that raise the hand button. Again, I want to stress math can be a little bit difficult, especially on the net. Key features. Number one, math, matrix algebra, linear algebra, same thing. As a breeder is a very useful tool you'll be using a lot. Almost every paper you'll read in animal breeding where they talk about methods will talk about matrices. So it's really important to have a loose understanding about what's kind of going on there. In a lecture like this, you want to just kind of get the main ideas, then go back and, for example, read chapter 9. and that'll talk about it. You can take your time, go through that, like the work examples, and get a much better appreciation. So if you're struggling a little bit to get caught up with here, relax. Don't worry about it. Just get some of the concepts. Okay, I don't quite know what a determinant is or what it does, but I can kind of see how it's important. I kind of get what an inverse is, but yes, but the fact you're thinking about those now means if you go back and read the notes, they'll make a lot more sense. So that's a key whenever you learn anything. The first time you hear it, it doesn't make sense. But that sets seed in your minds to make it easier to understand the next time you hear it. So I highly recommend when we're done with this lecture, just go back and read chapter 9. Don't read any other chapters. Chapter 9 will walk you through all this stuff, and hopefully it'll be a bit more clear around. Okay, let's go back to sharing. Give me a second here. So now we're going to talk about another concept for matrices, which are going to be related to eigenvalues. That's called the trace. So if I have a diagonal matrix, the trace, often called TR of A or trace of A, is simply the sum of the diagonal elements. And a cool thing is the trace equals the sum of the eigenvalues. So if I have an identity matrix that's 5 by 5, what's its trace? 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5. Its trace is 5. So with an identity matrix, the sum of the eigenvalues are 5. In fact, with an identity matrix, there's 5 eigenvalues, all of which are 1. Now, the reason we bring up trace, and now we're going to get something that's pretty practical. If I have a covariance matrix V, a matrix who on the diagonal are the variances or things we're measuring, on the off diagonal are covariances, trace of V gives me the total variation in that things I'm looking at. And I'll flesh this out in a second. In particular, the ith eigenvalue divided by the trace of V says what fraction of variation is accounted for by this linear combination. That's a principal component. Let me give you an example here. So here I have a variance covariance matrix. Trait 1, variance of 10, trait 2, variance of 20, trait 3, variance of 30. The variance, the covariance between 1 and 2 is -5, 1 and 3 is 10, 2 and 3 is 0. So it's a variance covariance matrix. Want to look at its eigenvalues and eigenvectors. The command eigen in R returns this. First eigenvector is 34, second is 21, final is here. This is the direction. These are the weights that give you the first eigenvector. It's also called PC1. This is the second eigenvector, third eigenvector. How do we interpret this? Trace is 60. That means the total amount of variation. If I make a linear combination where the weights on those linear combinations squared sum up to be 1, I can never make that larger than 60. So PC1 is 34.4 divided by 60. So the linear combination given by these weights accounts for 57% of all the variation in here. And what is that linear combination? Round that off, that's 0.4 times x1 minus 1.39 times x2 plus 9.06 times x3. If I take my data x1, x2, and x3, suppose, for example, they're environmental data, and now make this new index down here, this new synthetic trait, that synthetic trait accounts for almost 60% of all the variation as compared to looking at the three traits separately. That first combination, that weight that gives you those first two traits, is your PC1 value. So if I have, for example, you often see a PC plot, I've got, let's say, cassava, I've got a bunch of markers. My variance covariance matrix is a massive matrix full of markers. I do a PC1, PC2 plot. How do I get that? I go to cassava accession 1. I then look at the weights for PC1. This would be much, much longer, and then simply multiply those weights by the x1, x2, and x3 for that specific cassava all the way down to my markers. That gives me my first PC score. Then I take weights here. So now the weights would be 0.22 times x1 minus 1.5 times x2 minus 2.4 times x3. Again, use those same weights. That gives me my PC2 score. So that on my data is PC1, that on my data is PC2. I now have a PC1, PC2 score, I can get a dot. And when you see a PC plot, that's what's going on. And this is often called dimension reduction. If I've got a huge amount of data where there's likely some structure, like with marker data, the PC scores are a way of looking at that. So the amount of variation that PC1 accounts for is the first eigenvalue divided by the sum of all the eigenvalues. In this case, it would be 57. We're going to come back to PCs in a second, but that's kind of where they're from. When you hear the term PC, it's the same as an eigenvalue. So PC1 is the eigenvector associated with the largest eigenvalue. PC2 is the eigenvector associated with the next largest eigenvalue, and so on. A couple more concepts, and we're kind of in the home stretch here. So we're going to talk about quadratic products and also bilinear forms. So you'll very often see expressions like this, X transpose AX. That's this sum. We call it a quadratic product. Why? Because I've got xi xj, or for I equals j, I've got xi squared. These are either cross products or products. A bilinear form is similar, except the weights are different on either sides. These arise when computing variances. These arise when computing covariances. In particular, here's an index. What is that index? It's just C transpose X. So for example, I'm computing a predicted breeding value. I've got a weight, a vector of weights C1, C2 up to Cn for my individual marker, where C3 is the weight you put on how many copies at SNP3 you have of the reference allele. So that's either a 0, X is either a 0, 1, or 2. So that sum would be kind of your genetic prediction for an individual. And we can write that sum as C transpose X. What's the variance over the population of that? We work it out. It's C transpose VC, where V is the variance covariance matrix of the X's. Likewise, if I've got an index based upon weights A, an index based upon weights B, what's the covariance? It's the same thing, except it's A transpose B, VB. By the way, this is the same as B transpose VA. So an example. Let's go back to that same V matrix we had before. Here's index 1, 2, 1, minus 2, 5, index 2, 0, 6, minus 4. There are the weights. What's the variance of this first index in the population? Well, it's just C1 transpose V, C2. So V is the same as the variance of X. That gives me 960. What about for these weights? Do the same thing, you get 1200. What's the covariation between this and that? Well, it's just C1, variance covariance matrix C2, 910. I can then express that as a correlation by dividing that by the square root of that times that. So these quadratic products are very useful because very often, so things that look like this, very often we have weighted sums that we're looking at. When you see an expression like that, it means the variance of a weighted sum. And again, we'll see that in something like index selection. So now we're just about done. We're going to put all these things together. And again, don't worry about the mathematical details. Think about the basic ideas, the basic flow here. These next couple of slides are things you look up, not things you have to memorize. So when I'm classifying a distribution, I have something called a PDF. It's not a file type. It stands for probability density function. On a bell curve, it just says if I go to a certain point, how high is that bell curve? And for a normal, that curve is a function of the mean, which is the peak of that, and the spread, the variance of that. And it has this form here. So for variable I, it's got mean mu I and variance sigma squared A. These are weighted functions in here. So if I've got n independent normals, if X is a vector for value 1, value 2, value n, then that's the density function, because they're normal. We can rearrange those together, and I can, after a bunch of stuff, I can compactly write it this way. And this is the key here. The key here is that if I have a single normal, that is a univariate normal, it's defined by two things, a mean and a variance. If I've got a bivariate normal, it's defined by two objects, a mean vector and a variance covariance matrix. So when you move from a single normal with a mean and a variance to a multivariate normal, you change a mean to a mean vector, and more importantly, a variance to a variance covariance matrix. And those covariance terms, as we'll see, are going to be really, really important. Let me give you a couple of examples here. So we call this, so the circle here is an equal probability spread. So this mean value is called the centroid. If I cut this out as a piece of paper, the centroid is where I put my finger to balance it. And if you look here, so this is x1 and x2. If I shine a flashlight down here, that's the spread in x1. Shine a flashlight this way, that's the spread in x2. So both of these things have the same mean vector, and they both have the same variance in x1 and x2, but these structures look quite different. Why do they look quite different? Because there's a third element we haven't talked about. We've talked about the means for both. We've talked about the variances for both. We haven't talked about the covariances. So here, x1 and x2 has a positive covariance that gives this tilt. So a large value for x1 is a large value for x2. Here, there's no covariance. So these structures look quite different, even though both systems have the same mean vector and both systems have the same variances. But they look quite different because the covariance. And this is only for two variables. When you move up to 3 or 4 or 5 variables, those covariance terms really shape the geometry. So what we're concerned about with data is where the data is centered, that is the centroid, but much more interestingly is how are the data spread about that centroid? And that spread is given by the eigenstructure, the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of the variance covariance matrix V. Couple more examples. So what you see here is this is the case where that covariance is negative. A large value for x1 is a small value for x2. You can also have this elongation without a tilt. So what this says is that x1 is a smaller variance than x2, but there's no correlation. So when I stretch that out, it means that there's unequal variances. When I tilt it, it means there's a correlation among them. So the geometry of all of that is given by the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of V. In particular, here is a cloud of equal points. So I've got eigenvalues lambda 1 and lambda 2. So lambda 1 is the largest. So on this direction here, I've got the most, so the total variation is lambda 1 plus lambda 2. As lambda 1 gets much bigger than lambda 2, you get more stretched out. And the direction you get stretched out in is given by E1. As lambda 1 and lambda 2 get more similar, if I pull this one in here, to keep the sum constant, I've got to push that out. So if I have a perfect circle, lambda 1 equals lambda 2. So the eigenstructure, that is how the data are distributed about that mean value, is given by the eigenvectors tell you the direction of stretching, and the eigenvalues tell you how much stretch they have. Why this is critical, if I've got 1,000 variables and have a variance covariance matrix, you cannot look at that. In fact, you can't even print it out. But if you look at the eigenvalues plotted from largest to next largest, what you typically see is the eigenvalues are somewhat large, then they fall off very quickly. What that means is most of the data is distributed in just a few dimensions. So eigenvalues allow us to conceptualize very complicated structure. If the eigenvalues are all equal, it's a kind of a big beach ball in all directions. If the eigenvalues are unequal, you've got certain combinations that account for a lot more variation than others. So when you talk about a normal distribution, multivariate normal, the really interesting features are the eigenvalues, that variance covariance matrix. It tells you how much the data are displayed. Again, I want to stress, when you first hear this a little bit complicated, just relax, think about it in general terms, then go back and look at chapter 9 notes, which talks about this in a lot more detail. So again, PCs, or principal components, are the same as eigenvectors. So PC1 is the linear combination that accounts for the most variation. That weight there is simply the weights on the eigenvector corresponding to the largest eigenvalue. PC2 is the next direction at 90 degrees away from it. So PCI is the ith eigenvector. So the weight, that direction for the ith PC is given by the direction of the ith eigenvalue. The fraction of variation accounted for by PCI is just eigenvalue, the ith eigenvalue divided by the trace. If V has a few large eigenvalues, most variation is distributed in just a few dimensions, axes of variation. And you can generalize this idea for non-square matrices by something called the SVD, the singular value decomposition. That comes up, for example, in G by E studies like AMY models. Just to close off, you can have some properties of the multivariate normal. I'll just mention those. I kind of won't go through them. We're kind of running late in the day here. But basically, you can use those to make various predictions and stuff. So I think if you're interested in more of that, just go to the notes that will talk about that. But I think that's a good, clean place to stop because it's kind of running over an hour and I get too technical at the end, people can kind of glaze over. So what are the key take-home points in 1 minute? Number one, vectors and matrices, vectors are a special type of matrix, are incredibly useful because this is how you handle data as a breeder. The eigenstructure of a variance-covariance matrix is incredibly important because it tells you a lot about the nature of your data. Is it a beach ball? Is it a long, elongate balloon? And so these basic concepts of eigenstructure, eigenvalues, determinants may seem rather abstract, but as a breeder, they'll be very concrete. And we'll see examples of how you apply all this tomorrow when we talk about multi-trait selection and index selection. Okay? And with that, again, I highly recommend you, after this lecture, go back and read over chapter 9. I think a lot of stuff will be a lot more clearly because you have time to kind of process that. So question number one, let me turn off my video so I'm not squaring at it. Paul says, in matrix algebra, what causes PC1 to have the largest value? That's by construction. So you compute the eigenvalues, then you call the first one eigenvalue 1, the second one eigenvalue 2, the third one eigenvalue 3. And so by construction, you find the eigenvalues and you call the largest 1, and the corresponding eigenvector is PC1. The next largest is eigenvalue 2, corresponding eigenvector, eigenvalue is PC2. So it's kind of by construction to make things easy. So it means when you get your computer output, you have to scan down 5,000 to see what the largest one is. They order them for you. Largest one first, next largest one, etc. Again, I want to stress that chapter 9 is a relatively easy read, and it talks about all these things that I've talked about in that. So I'd recommend after this you go back and read through that. I think things will make a bit more sense. Then wait a day or two, go back and read it again. Things will make even more sense. You don't get this stuff right away, so if you're frustrated you're not getting it, don't worry. That's very, very common. You now have the seeds to get it a little bit easier next time you try it. Paul, question.
Yes.
Paul, go ahead.
Thank you.
I can't hear you. Your voice is down.
Okay.
A little better.
Do you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. So if I understand you correctly, the matrix that is actually generated is rearranged so that the PC1 is the largest.
No, it's not rearranged. What happens is all that rearranging occurs by just shifting the weights on the eigenvectors. So if you order the eigenvalues differently, you just simply shift the weights on those elements in E, their positions get swapped around. Let's
Okay.
go over here. Go ahead. Innocent says, does uncorrelated means no covariance? Yes. So let me be specific here. So uncorrelated and independent means different things. If I have a normal distribution, uncorrelated means independent, and uncorrelated means the variance covariance matrix is diagonal. There's zeros on the off diagonal, and we call those uncorrelated. If two variables are uncorrelated, then on that variance covariance matrix, those corresponding elements would be 0. Other questions or comments? So highly recommend you go and read chapter 9. And then tomorrow it's going to be a little bit longer, maybe running about this time, maybe slightly longer. I have to go camping right after, so I'm motivated to finish early. We're going to then apply these to talk about multi-trait selection and index selection. Okay? And those notes, by the way, are already posted. So everybody have a wonderful day, and I will see you all bright and early, for me at least, tomorrow.
Great.
All right.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Thank you so much, Bruce. See you tomorrow.
Okay, cheers, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.